Hi there, my name is Will Patillo. I'm on the onboarding team at PauseAI, and this is the second video on internal strategy, this one on our action ecosystem. The purpose of this video is to give an overview of the types of activism at PauseAI and how they all fit together. The intended value is to give some ideas as to where you can slot yourself into the organization and how your work as an individual serves the larger whole. This can help answer questions like, why does this matter? How is this actually helping? Another value I hope to convey here is an appreciation for other people with different skill sets and diverse ways of thinking. This is a very ambitious task that we're taking on, and it takes all kinds. A couple of core concepts that I want to highlight here. The first one is this arrow in the top left called a value vector, where how far you go is dependent on the magnitude and the direction. Put a lot of energy into activism, but we don't put in the similar amount of effort to make sure that we're pushing for the right thing or for policies that make sense. That would be magnitude without direction, which would be making us part of the problem. Whereas if we put endless amounts of energy into getting the direction absolutely perfect, just debating things endlessly, getting into finer and finer details, that would be direction without magnitude. And we might come up with some really interesting plans, but none of them would actually happen, and so it wouldn't matter. The next concept I want to bring up are these arrows on the bottom called feedback loops. So there's three types: negative or self-limiting. That's the one on the left. The one in the middle is positive feedback or self-reinforcing. And the one on the far right is linear or no feedback. Negative feedback is whenever the more effort you put in, the less results there are, either because of diminishing returns or because of strengthening some opposing force. An example of a place where I see a lot of negative feedback is narrative warfare on social media, where people just kind of go in and making insults and blasting people and making really clever takedowns and whatever else. That generates a lot of engagement pretty quickly. You can get a lot of views, a lot of likes, and maybe there's some impact there. The big problem with it is the more successful you are, the more that angers people on the other side of the debate, such as effective accelerationists or tech people or whatever else. And they start putting more energy into making counter memes and counter arguments and pushing back harder and harder. Also, if you come up with some clever rhetorical strategy, then the other side's just going to reverse engineer it and use that against us. This doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't pursue these kind of activities at all, just being aware that there's the potential for some negative feedback to be present here. A positive feedback loop might look something more like recruitment, where I bring in a couple of people and some of those bring in other people, and then the more people that are in, the more people there are bringing new people in, and you have this kind of exponential growth. For linear improvements, lobbying might be like this, where the amount of effort you put into lobbying doesn't really have any impact one way or the other on how much impact there'll be from being involved in more lobbying. That may or may not be true, but that's the first example that comes to mind. The reason it's very useful to think about feedback loops is this is probably the most important consideration in determining what kind of actions are going to have the biggest magnitude. It could be very easy to look at just the immediate gratification of how much impact does this seem to be having right now. But the bigger picture is, does this feed into a positive feedback loop that's going to grow exponentially, or is this something that's going to limit itself over time? The next topic is over on the right side, interconnected systems. So you may be familiar with the idea that when you have a problem that you're trying to solve, if that problem is a symptom of a different problem, then just addressing the symptom is going to be limited. It's going to be a very negative feedback kind of strategy, because any progress that you make there, well, the source of the problem is still showing up. So the problem will come right back, or maybe it'll show up in some other way. Whereas if you address the root cause, then that'll address that and then also make downstream issues solve themselves a little bit more easily, at least. However, that kind of root cause analysis assumes a relatively simple causality. A causes B, causes C, and so on. Whereas what often happens in the real world is something that's a little more complex and messy than that, where A and B both cause each other, and then C causes both of them and is impacted by everything, and everything's all kind of jumbled up.
A consequence of working in an interconnected system is that every single node in this entire system is caused by something else and is also the cause of it. If you focus on any single thing, then you're going to run into problems from the other nodes pushing against you and getting a very strong negative feedback signals there, where it becomes hard to change anything. However, if you're able to work on all of the nodes simultaneously, then you get the opposite of effect, where rather than them fighting against each other, they all reinforce each other and you get a positive feedback. Now, it may be impossible for any individual to work on many different things at once, and that's what collaboration's for. It allows people to separate into groups, work together, help each other out. Then the whole is more than the sum of its parts. A last concept I want to bring up here is the process funnel. So when we dive into any particular node individually, there's often this dynamic where there's various levels of task. On the top level of the funnel, that reaches lots of people or it's available for lots of people to work on. It's fairly low effort, low energy. Whereas when you go lower in the funnel, that tends to take more energy, can be done by fewer people, is directed at fewer people, is just higher engagement, down to the bottom of the funnel, which is very intense, very focused. The point of knowing when you're in a funnel is knowing which stage you're in and adapting the kind of tasks you engage in, the mindset you use, and your just overall strategy accordingly. Speaking of interconnected systems, the big one that I want to focus on a very high level for PauseAI's theory of impact is this idea of inside game, outside game, and organization, where inside game is working with people in power, outside game is mass mobilization, and organization is just the logistics and behind the scenes kind of stuff. A point that I want to make over the next several slides is to investigate what each of these are and how they interrelate. Starting with the inside game, again, the meaning of this is convincing people in power. This could be legislatures, people working at AI companies, anyone who has the capacity to make meaningful decisions. This can include emailing politicians, drafting and critiquing legislation, changing culture in AI companies by having people work within it or talk to people who are there, anything like that. The value of inside game approaches is it has direct access to the mechanisms of change. Ultimately, change has to happen from people who have the power to make decisions. Working with them directly or becoming them, you can obviously have a lot of leverage. The danger of relying too heavily on inside game approaches is that you're often just going to get the runaround. You go to lobby a politician, and instead of meeting with them, they just have you meet with a staffer, and the staffer nods along, is very sympathetic, and it says a lot of nice things. And then they take your little two-pager of the proposals you want, and then they just go toss it in the shredder and forget about the whole thing. Because they weren't actually trying to help you, they just wanted to appease one of their voters and make it look like they're helping you. If you can get past that issue of being held at arm's length, then you can run into Faustian bargains where they say, okay, this is a good proposal, but it's not really realistic. So we're going to need you to compromise a little bit, tone this down, make it a little less radical. And so you make a compromise, then you make a compromise on the compromise, then you make a compromise on that. And then when something finally gets approved, then it gets watered down through all the various layers until what actually ends up passing is something that's totally unrelated to what you actually wanted. You end up getting nothing and sacrificing everything. And then even if you can get past endless compromising and you get people in power to say, yes, we're taking this idea, we're taking it seriously, we're not going to water it down, we get what this is about, then you can run into deception where they make all these promises when it's all stuff that's going to happen in the future. And in return, they get your support in the present. And then once they don't need you anymore, or there are other interests that are more important, then they immediately drop your cause and do the opposite of everything that they promised. OpenAI is a good example. It started off as a safety company, but really they ended up kicking off the AI arms race. All the people who were really interested in safety have walked out. When they tried to push out Sam Altman for various deceptive practices, he just made it run a coup on the company and came right back in. And that's actually indicative of just a general failure of the AI safety movement, which was that it relied too exclusively on inside game type tactics, and they ran into all the dangers that I just mentioned. This is not because they necessarily went about any of their lobbying or talking to people wrong. It's that it wasn't supported by other things, like an outside pressure to make sure that the people they were talking to actually listened and followed through. And there was some rationale behind it. Like some of the early thinking by Yudkowsky and other people in the AI safety movement believed sincerely that the cause of making AI safe was too complicated, and if regular people got involved, the messaging would get diluted and it would go off track and end up causing more harm than good. So they tried to keep it to very elite groups of people, but this just massively backfired.
Now, I'd like to take a moment and balance out some of these criticisms I'm making of the early AI safety movement, pointing out that it wasn't all failure. They made some pretty significant successes, one of which was all the discussions of AI safety, figuring out that there actually was a problem, identifying what it was, and what would need to be done to mitigate it. And that's really important because that lays the groundwork for the messaging we're making today. Beyond messaging, understanding the problem as well as possible is very useful in being able to move quickly into proposing solutions that actually have a chance of working. My point in talking about the failure here is not to bash Miri or effective altruism. It's just that if we're going to be maximally effective, we need to be honest about the mistakes we've made in the past and learn from them.
Inside game is really important stuff. It just needs to be supported by other things. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what actually happens in this category of action. At the top, we have emailing politicians. This can be done by pretty much anyone. It doesn't take a huge amount of effort, and you can send lots of them. So this is a very top of the funnel sort of task. If you get lucky, this email may result in actually meeting someone and being able to talk to them one-on-one directly. This is going to happen less often, and it's going to take a lot more preparation work. But you don't have to be super level expertise because just speaking authentically as a citizen is pretty good, but the more prepared you can be, the better. So if you get to this point where you're meeting, definitely recommend reaching out on the PauseAI server and talking to some other people who've gone through the process of meeting with politicians before and may be able to help you out, give you some pointers, give you a chance to practice your pitch. Also, we have a lot of materials available that you can hand out during a meeting. Now, if you meet with a politician, that's not just this one and done kind of thing. Ideally, that's the beginning of an ongoing relationship that you have with that politician. And that relationship is the essence of lobbying, where you continue to track how things are going, give your input on various things. You establish yourself as being a trustworthy source. That's essentially what a lobbyist is. The goal of this lobbying is to ultimately have influence on the policymaking process, which actually changes what happens in the world. With each of these core ideas, inside, outside, organization, I like to think of a core virtue that's associated with it to get in the right mindset for the kind of work that's involved. For the inside game, I contend the core virtue is rationality. This is an area where it's very important to get the details right. Maybe not so much on the initial email, but certainly as you go down the funnel, it becomes more and more important to be really accurate on your direction. Because if you tell a politician the wrong thing and they believe it, then that might result in legislation that's actually makes things worse. So the more careful you can be, the better. And this involves being mindful of trade-offs, which may involve having to accept some bad things to prevent other bad things or give up some good things in order to get other good things. This also involves recognizing that different people that you can talk to have more power and influence than others. And if you have to choose who you give priority, being mindful of these power dynamics and trying to play up as much as possible is part of this moral calculus that you need when you're playing the inside game. Because ultimately, the focus here needs to be on what generates the best outcomes, even if it might go against some intuitions that you have. It's really important to go past ego and preconceived notions and say, like, what actually is going to have the biggest and best impact. Moving on to outside game, this again is about mobilizing the masses. So examples of outside game tactics include protests, local and virtual meetups, being on the Discord community and having conversations with people there, handing out flyers, putting up posters, and so on. The value of the outside game is this changes the cultural conversation around AI and also shapes the incentives of politicians. It also gives a lot of power to the people who are focused on the inside game kind of tactics. So if I go into a meeting with a politician and I'm just some guy who cares about this thing and no one else does, they're going to be polite and listen and all that. It's like, okay, that's an interesting theory you have there, and then probably not think a whole lot more about it. On the other hand, if I'm representing 10,000 of their constituents who are super active on this issue and will vote for someone depending on how aligned that politician is with their interests, now suddenly what I have to say becomes a lot more interesting because politicians want to get reelected. The danger of focusing too exclusively on outside game tactics is that it can end up being something like a pyramid scheme, where if the only thing that I am doing as an activist is to convince other people to be activists, and then once I convince them, what am I actually asking them to do? Well, that's just to convince other people to be activists and them to convince others. At a certain point, you got to ask, like, what is this all for? Like, what are we actually trying to change? Do we need like everyone in the world to be in our cause for anything to happen? And also, if all this energy doesn't translate into actual victories that are a little bit more tangible that people can point to and say, like, this is why we were doing all this, we have a win, eventually, all of that growing enthusiasm will start to fizzle. That sense of growth is only going to go so far. People will start to get impatient, and then they start leaving, and then the growth starts to slow down and reverse, and then you start losing energy because there isn't even that growth anymore. Eventually, the whole thing fizzles, and it didn't really accomplish anything other than giving people a chance to virtue signal or whatever. One comically severe failure of this was the Coney 2012, this really big social movement that came out of nowhere and then quickly fizzled and didn't really have any point to it, as far as I remember. Also, and this one's a little bit more nuanced because it has had some impact on shifting what kinds of things are acceptable to talk about and broader cultural impacts. But the Occupy Wall Street movement didn't really have a whole lot of clear legislative wins in the moment, and it also definitely fizzled out. Whatever impacts it may have had, it did not become this sustained, organized force that continued to build over time. We want something that's a little bit more sustainable than that. Digging into the process of the outside game, there's a multiple different funnels here, and how many of them I divide them up is actually kind of arbitrary. But on the one hand, in terms of outreach, there's flyering at the top. Anyone can do this. It gets lots of visibility, but it's not very high level of engagement. Down a little bit in the funnel would be like setting up a table with some interactive demonstration and really draw people in, get them to sign up for the website and have extended conversations. And then both of these can, in addition to just talking about AI, they can also have a second purpose of advertising a meetup that people can go to be in person. And they'll have some kind of short lecture at the beginning to introduce a topic. Maybe people form into small groups of like 6 to 8, have a conversation about something, and then share the results of their conversation with the whole group. And the topics could be like, well, what is the economy going to look like in a time of mass automation? Something kind of open-ended where people can take a bunch of different ways. The idea is to get people really thinking about the sort of issues that are relevant and empower them to actually talk to each other rather than just being passive and going with the flow. These meetups can then be in a series that builds towards the mission statement that we have and culminates in a protest where people all get together, hold signs or chant. And this protest serves as a capstone to the meetups where you have people talking about this thing and they're just getting more and more engaged. And then eventually that needs an outlet to actually be active and move around and feel like they're having some kind of impact. The protest does two different things. One is it gains visibility to the movement as a whole. Maybe there's some reporters that show up, maybe the people that walk by are like, hey, what's all this about? It gets attention. The other value of a protest is it builds solidarity among the people who go. So now people, after attending a protest, it starts to feel a lot more invested in what they're involved in. And so then they become the next round of volunteers to flyer, then table and host meetups and organize the next round of protests. And again, all of this is to support the strength of the inside game tactics that are happening in parallel to all of this. In terms of discussion, you can have another process funnel that goes from just having conversations with friends and family towards broader reach discussions on social media, where you build up a following and get to more people. A broader reach than social media would be just the traditional media, getting someone to appear on news outlets or talk to reporters. And then at the bottom of this funnel, you have someone who becomes a public figure, someone like Jeff Hinton, who goes around talking to various media outlets and their name and face gets associated with the movement. Again, this follows this same pattern where the top levels of the funnel are available to anyone. And then as you go down lower, it's more intensive and fewer people that are able to be involved with it. My point in all of this, there's a place for all of these things. It's just in knowing which level of the funnel you're working at and adapting accordingly. The core virtue of outside game tactics is sociability. The core thing to think about here when you're trying to bring people in is what are the psychological reasons that people have for joining a movement like PauseAI? We like to think about it being rational. They're convinced by the arguments. AI is going to become really dangerous. This is the best use of my time, so I'm going to join it. And maybe some people from effective altruism think like that. But for the most part, when someone joins something like this, it's for social reasons. It's because maybe their friends are joining, or maybe there's just a really interesting community and interesting stuff to talk about on the Discord server, or there's just this kind of energy at the protest that they want to be a part of, and it's really fun to be there. People want to be interconnected. That's a core need. So when you're designing actions in the outside game category, the social impact and dynamics are something that should be front and center of a lot of your considerations. A big part of this that I think about a lot, especially in onboarding, is empowering people. After talking to them for a while, you should be giving them agency, lifting them up, giving them power to try things that they want and to have their voice heard, not obsessing too much about over optimizing and finding the perfect process. It's really important to stay human. Because if you don't, like if you take a ends justify the means kind of mindset, that might work great if you're lobbying. But when it's just talking to people in community and you're just using people as things for something else, that requires a disconnect between what you're saying and what's actually really going on. And that's a level of secrecy. In just one-off interactions, you might get away with secrecy and nobody notices. But the more your relationships are ongoing and the more they're with a community of people that all talk to each other, the more they'll start to see that disconnect and notice that something isn't quite right, or even catch you in a moment of hypocrisy or lying or anything else like that. Holding on a mask is going to be impossible the deeper these kind of relationships go. So the only way around it is to just be genuine and to speak what's actually on your mind, talk to people as people, because eventually they're going to notice. The last node in the interconnected ecosystem is organization. This is the behind the scenes logistics. So examples of it include maintaining the website, managing the server, organizing meetups, building teams, onboarding new people, training, fundraising. The benefit of working in an organizational place is that it connects the inside and outside games together. It makes sure that the systems that we build are sustainable and intentionally designs positive feedback loops. The dangers of putting too much effort in organization in the absence of other things is you could start getting some just ossification where things just get really static and rigid and not responsive to change, bureaucracy, people seeking power within the organization. It really needs to be in service of the other things rather than an end in itself. We look at the process funnel for organization. At the top, volunteering. This is when there's a very clearly defined task and it just needs people to work on it. Down a little bit further is onboarding, where you're encouraging other people to volunteer. Next is organizing, where you're creating and managing the tasks that the volunteers are working on. And then at the bottom of the funnel, there's leadership, where you're setting the overall goals and direction of the organization as a whole. As with other things in the funnel, everyone starts at the top, and then some people move down to deeper levels if they're a good fit and they have the time and interest. I think the core virtue of organizers is humility, because a lot of the work in this category is not necessarily glamorous. It's not on the front lines, you're not super visible. Really, the goal is to lift up other people rather than actually doing the things yourself. But it's very necessary. Without organizers, everyone else just gets stuck. It's also very important here to be able to balance different interests against each other, to accept trade offs and accept outcomes that are good enough. And that requires letting go of a lot of ego or ideology of it has to be just this way and it needs to be perfect. No, there's different people who think differently, and you need to accommodate a lot of different things. And being able to let go in that way is ultimately an act of humility. It's also very important as an organizer to be able to listen and respond to feedback. Don't assume that you have all of the answers. One concept in this idea of humility in the organizer role that I find very interesting is something called servant leadership. So we're very used to leadership as being like a boss that orders other people around. Servant leadership on the surface looks the same, but the rationale and the power is kind of inverted. But at a certain point, it becomes necessary to bring someone in whose job it is to support everyone, to just focus on the communication aspects, to listen to everyone. It's like, oh, hey, you're working on this thing, that this other person's working on the same thing. You should talk to each other and figure this out. Or to just keep track of all the things that are being done to make sure that nothing's missed, and then help people work on the things that are the most useful. Expertise is assumed to be primarily with the people who are actually on the ground working and advancing the interests of the organization. The organizers are there as support staff to make everything else possible. I'll post some links for more about what servant leadership actually looks like. So now that I've talked about these three different aspects, the key point I want to make with all of them is how they fit together. The power of our organization, it's the how much effectiveness is done on the inside game multiplied by the effectiveness of the outside game multiplied by the effectiveness of the organization. If any of these are not in place, then the value of the others gets multiplied by 0. And if all of them are in place, but to varying degrees, then the biggest impact is going to go from strengthening whichever one is weakest. That's one consideration in terms of where you want to fit yourself in. An even bigger consideration is just finding what your own personal niche is. What are you good at? And what traits are you most suited towards? I also have this diagram here of all these various parts and how they inform each other. Organizers provide rules and unity and a clear sense of mission to the people working on the inside game. They also provide order and clarity and guidance towards the people working on mass mobilization in the outside game. Meanwhile, the insiders give the focus and the strategy to the organization and also typically form the core leadership team of the organizers, tend to be drawn from this group, and they provide a sense of purpose and direction to the outside game. The people playing the outside game and mass mobilizing provide a vitality and community and just raw numbers to filling out a lot of the work in the organization. And then they also provide power and strength of representation to the people who are lobbying. They also provide a certain sense of accountability. When you're on the inside game too long, it's necessary to compromise a lot. It can be easy to forget what you're really there for. You can start to feel like the compromised view is the point, and that the more radical views are going to destroy your credibility. And there's some truth to that. Like you can't propose something to a legislator that's totally not feasible in the current political climate. But at the same time, you need to remember what you're really here for, what the end goal is. And having the energy of the more radical conversation shifting people on the outside can help you stay accountable to your true purpose. So I've been talking a lot about all the various parts and how they fit together, but remember the original point of this presentation is, can we make a difference? Here's where I start to transition from the how to the why this matters. By hitting all the points of the interconnected system, rather than having them each inhibited by the lack of the others, they all reinforce each other by their presence. This makes it possible to, say, recruit 2 people who recruit 2 other people, and that all that relies on the people that you bring in actually sticking around, because there's nothing that feels like this obvious weak point that makes them see like, we don't really have any clear goals, or there's no popular force behind this. or it's all disorganized, all these things that could cause people to leave over time. If you address all of those, people can feel that and then they want to stick around, and so you can support this kind of exponential growth. Also, the more successful we're able to be as an organization without much in the way of fundraising, the more fundraisers can say, this organization is serious, they can do a lot with a little. I'm going to give them some money so that it can open up options for further success, which could then feed back into more fundraising. These are just a number of a couple of positive feedback loops that can get going once everything is in place. Once you have a positive feedback loop, you have an exponential. And so it can feel like there's not much happening right now, but if you have this 2x growth and followed by another 2x, 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 eventually that can go from very little to just a massive amount in potentially a very short time, depending on how tight that loop is. The power of this dynamo effect becomes even more apparent when you imagine what it looks like from the tech lobby or people in power who just don't want anything to change. If we get this positive feedback loops going, then that puts them into a bit of a bind. Either they can just ignore us and say nothing, and then we're able to just keep growing organically through this internal process that we have, or they can start attacking us, trying to suppress our voice, call us crazy, cultists, whatever other nonsense they have. And that's a total mistake, because that just gives us free publicity and builds public sympathy. Now, this, of course, is all assuming that we're clearly in the right. The more solid our arguments are, the more effort we've put into really understanding the situation and the points that we're advocating, that we're picking the right policies to support, the more people opposing us have to resort to lies and self-contradictions, the more they have to rely on just obvious ad hominems and nonsense to go on the attack. And the more they lean into these negative, ridiculous approaches, the more that's just going to make the attackers seem ridiculous and drive people to us actively, even faster than we would be able to recruit them ourselves. As an example of this, I think a very common story for myself and a lot of other people who've joined. I first learned about AI and existential risk from reading Less Wrong and Elias Yudkowsky's writings. My first thought on all this was like, okay, this is an interesting theory. This is worth a little bit more consideration. I wonder what the other side has to say about all of this. And then I go searching online and find people who are opposing a lot of those ideas and just run into nonsense. Like there's just things that are totally hand wavy, not really thought out, clearly contradicting reality, just total straw mans, not paying attention to what they're actually arguing against. And that's the moment where I really started to become convinced. It wasn't from hearing the arguments, came from hearing the counter arguments that were just terrible. And I think this is a fairly common experience. For that dynamic to continue, we need to continue being responsive to changes and stay in the right. So if we become too rigid, too radical, or start endorsing bad strategies or policies that are going to cause a lot of negative side effects, or allow for negative dynamics to start showing up in the kind of the social space, such that there become legitimate criticisms, and then we fail to give coherent responses to those criticisms, then that would cause those criticisms to stick a lot harder and have more impact, both internally in terms of like, oh, wait, maybe this is kind of true. I'm not so sure I want to be so active. And also on the outside of like, oh yeah, those guys are crazy. I don't want to join them. But as long as we stay on the right side of things and get our organization firmed up as possible, the better the trajectory is going to be. The next concept for theory of impact I want to bring up is called the whirlwind. So this is the idea that eventually there's going to be events that happen in the world that scare people, shock them, or provide some kind of energy that drives them to us in large numbers, suddenly and unexpectedly. And I think that a popular pushback against AI is inevitable because the capabilities are advancing exponentially. AI labs are being just obscenely reckless on the level of security. There's really nothing to stop any concerted effort from China from advancing their AI just by copying us. They're reckless in terms of their safety teams walking out and not really investing in that alignment or that side of things. And they're reckless in not even considering the social impacts of their technology at all, not even trying on that front. And we can see some growth in pushback happening now from artists losing their jobs, from deepfakes making information on the internet less reliable, scams starting to emerge and affecting more and more people, education being undermined, students cheating in the education and not learning anything. AI is having impacts right now, and these impacts are just going to get bigger over time. We've already been getting waves of people who are joining who've never heard of existential risk or any of that stuff before, who are joining for other reasons that are more immediate, and that's going to grow. Our job is to channel the public energy that's coming from these outside events towards pro-social outcomes, making sure that all the popular pushback goes in the direction of policies that actually make things better rather than just letting that energy fizzle out. Politicians creating satisficing solutions that just kick the can down the road, cover up the problems without really dealing with any of the kind of root causes, and then just keep doing that until it's too late, or reactionary groups taking things in some other direction that just makes things worse. There's a lot of ways that the future popular pushback could not have any impact or make things worse. Our job is like carving out a riverbed so that when the water shows up, it goes to the right place. The idea of things just chugging along in the current way things are going, in just total business as usual sort of fashion, just does not seem realistic to me, given how transformative AI is going to be on society, to the extent, and it already has been. The outcome is not predetermined. Something's going to happen, but what happens could be good or bad. That brings us to some of the failure modes, some of the ways that all of this could very reasonably go wrong. One of them is polarization, AI safety being categorized as a left or a right issue. Once that happens and starts to get entrenched, then we're going to max out at 50% of people caring about this. And then the other 50% are just going to be super against it. This is what happened with the environmentalist movement. Environmentalism used to be a bipartisan issue that both Republicans and Democrats were equally supportive of. But then various forces, including mistakes made by the environmentalist movement, caused that to start to lean a little bit more to the left, and then they didn't counteract that, and it became more and more associated with the left until the right was just totally entrenched against it. We can't allow that to happen with AI. How to prevent that from happening is it's a whole conversation in itself. I'll put a link to a further discussion of that in the description on this video. Another failure mode is timidity, not respecting the timelines, whether that's from worrying too much about what's acceptable to say and not taking the initiative in setting the conversation ourselves. Just not putting in enough effort would be a failure of timidity. This one would not be an issue if we had 100 years. One saying I like is there are no impossible tasks, only impossible timelines. We might not have enough time for the level of ambition that this movement is taking. We just have to rise to the challenge, and hopefully it's enough. Another failure mode is disorganization. If we don't have enough people on the inside or the outside or internal organization, and there's processes that are not as good as they could be, that can cause an opportunity to show up and just pass us right by. Another failure mode is violence, either by engaging in violent tactics externally or by social violence internally of this top-down control, people seeking power, dominating each other, internal schisms. Violence can be a very tempting thing because when you're trying to accomplish a lot, there's barriers and say, well, I'll just destroy the barrier, then I can get what I want. The problem with violence is it goes against all the core virtues that I talked about earlier. It's behaving irrational. It destroys sociability. People don't want to be around each other when there's just anger and destruction around. That's scary and it hurts. It goes against humility. Actively power seeking, that goes against servant leadership. By breaking all these core virtues, it might get some short-term gains, but in the long term is going to erode the foundations of what the movement relies on to work. One other potential failure mode is fragmentation. For example, the people working on the inside get all concerned that the outsiders are making them look bad, too radical or whatever else. And the outsiders are criticizing the people on the inside that they're compromising too much, and they end up fighting each other more than working towards a common goal. Or if we allow ourselves to get distracted by this ridiculous debate about whether we should be more concerned about existing harms versus future harms, as if these were somehow mutually exclusive. Like, I don't understand that at all. If that narrative of it's one or the other takes the forefront and gets too much attention, that's something that could destroy us. We're all concerned about the same things. We're all working towards the same goal. That's what matters. So enough about failure. Let's talk about success. Pause AI is really focused on trying to stop AI development. One question that can come up is like, okay, so that gets us a little bit more time. So what? We can't pause forever, right? My main response to that is to think about what is necessary for a pause to happen. What are the things that have to be in place for a pause to occur? Achieving those prerequisites are in many ways actually more important than the pause itself. So let's think about the requirements for a pause. One is that we need international coordination to be in place. If the United States just stops, for example, and China keeps going ahead, that's obviously no good. It has to be across the board. And for a pause to happen internationally, there needs to be international coordination. This means that countries have to talk to each other. They have to agree to things about monitoring. There needs to be communication channels, mutual discussion of enforcement mechanisms, ways of actually shutting down AI if there starts to be a problem. This might look like some form of compute governance or something else. What that international coordination looks like is an open question. The most obvious answer is some kind of international governance, but it might look like something more bottom up and distributed. We shouldn't be too attached to particular solutions. The problem is what we're focused on. There may be many ways, some that haven't even been thought of yet, of achieving it. And figuring that stuff out would be a really big deal. And then actually implementing it is a complex process that we need to start on as soon as possible. One consequence of this international coordination is overcoming all the barriers to coordination. There are a lot of concepts around like multipolar traps, prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of the commons, race to the bottom, arms race. All of these are failures of coordination. Nobody wants an out of control AI that destroys everything. No one wants an internet that is so filled with fake content that nobody can trust anything anymore. No one wants a destroyed education system. Nobody wants everyone to be losing their jobs and have no way of supporting themselves. These are all terrible things. Nobody wants them, but we're on track towards having them anyways. We're all part of this larger system that's moving in that direction, and no one has the power to stop it for reasons that no one's individually responsible for, but everyone is partially responsible for. What that looks like when we're no longer a bunch of individuals all pursuing our own interests, even though it's destructive to the whole, is a world where there is a broader care for the full ecology of values and what people care about. It's a world where everyone has some kind of voice in what happens so that everyone's interests can be considered rather than just some people rising up and taking power from everyone else and then them racing against the other people who are in power, having to act as if they're sociopathic, even if they're actually not. That's the thing that we need to break away from. So then if we have this different paradigm for how things work, for how we all relate to each other as a global society, you think of the implications of that. In a world where we have succeeded in stopping the reckless advancement of AI, this is a world that still has technology. It almost certainly still has artificial intelligence in some form. It might even have some degree of artificial general intelligence. Maybe there's even an artificial superintelligence if we can really figure out how to align it in a way that doesn't have a bunch of negative consequences or destroy all meaning or whatever else. It's hard to know how far that goes, but there's definitely going to be technology. The difference is that it will be directed towards actually solving problems without endlessly creating new ones. The consequence of that is being able to work towards a comprehensively better world rather than just a locally better world that makes other things worse. That is one path that we can move in. And another path that we can move in is this just relentless progress towards some form of self-termination or dystopia. Which path we go down is dependent on choices that are made in potentially in this decade. Timelines might be a little longer than that, but the time we're in right now is the most important pivotal decade of any time in our past or any time in our future. This is the most important moment that there will ever be. the actions that you take are going to be a part of choosing which path we go down. Even if you're just sending out emails or putting up flyers, that's a small piece of a much, much bigger thing. It's hard to imagine anything we could be doing with our time that's more important. So, thank you so much for being a part of this.